Hi, Holly. Welcome to the podcast. Before we get into lots about nutrition and periods and ovulation and all of that good stuff, would you let the audience know a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Of course. And firstly, thank you so much for having me on your podcast. I'm thrilled to be here. So my name's Holly Dunn, and I'm a registered nutritionist and nutritional therapy practitioner, specialising in hormone health. So I'm particularly here missing periods and hypothalamic amenorrhea and mental health as well. And that's sort of me kind of in a nutshell, really. My practice obviously is mostly online. So I work with clients from all over the country and the world as well. I do other bits and bobs in terms of corporate work, but that's sort of kind of all you need to know for this podcast, I think.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you. So is hypothalamic amenorrhea something that you have like personal experience with, or is it just something that you've always been just interested in?
Yeah, no, absolutely, 100% personal experience. I don't know if I'd ever really would have found out much about it, certainly in my nutritional training, if I hadn't been experiencing it. And I was experiencing it in the, when I during my training as well, my initial training. So I'm doing a master's degree at the moment, so my initial qualification. So yes, I definitely resonate with that whole experience, the feeling of not knowing what's going on, and for a long time thinking it was entirely normal, and also becoming your own health detective. Again, it's not something that's conventionally taught on in a lot about on medical programs and certainly nutrition degrees, and there's really nothing on this subject. We touch on it in terms of malnutrition and undernutrition and potentially stress-related disorders, but it very much was a question of doing some of my own research to fix it. So everyone out there listening, if you do have it and you're feeling really lost, I take my hat off to you, my metaphorical hat off to you, because it's tough going for sure.
Yeah, it definitely is. I think that's the case with a lot of people who work in this space. They all have personal experience with it because that is how they've learnt about it, because it really isn't spoken about very much. I think it's being spoken about a bit more than it was in the past, but it's still very like misunderstood, and even medical like professionals don't really know anything about it. Like when the whole time I was going through like my eating disorder treatment, not once did anybody mention my periods. Nobody asked about it. When they were told that I didn't have a period, they would just like, just go on the pill. And that seems to be the answer for everything, which drives me a little bit insane.
Yeah, of
So
course.
I'm so glad that there's people like you that are actually teaching people different ways to get their period back without going on the pill, which we know isn't an actual period and is just not the answer. So if somebody has HA and they're ready to start recovering and doing the right things to get their period back, what in terms of nutrition should they be focusing on primarily?
Yeah, so this is a really, really good question, and it's something I was searching for and doing all the research and training. So, if I've got a missing period and this is to do with nutrition, I must be deficient in something. Something must be missing, or I must be, something must be up. And I guess it's important to contextualize this with respect to the fact that what should we be focusing on? This is personal, right? So I look at food diaries all day, and we do, a nutritional assessment and this sort of stuff. And no two food diaries are the same, so it's really about personalizing and finding, what is the imbalance there. But broadly speaking, energy availability, total energy intake, that's incredibly important alongside your distribution of energy throughout the day. And this is nutrients aside, but I will come on to nutrients, but got to get some of those basics right. And I'm sure you know that as well from your own reading and experience too. In terms of nutrients, firstly, I guess, like, what are nutrients? Well, we can divide them into two categories. So we can divide them into macronutrients, which are carbohydrates, proteins, and fats primarily. So these are the nutrients that we require in large amounts. They provide us with energy, and they can also function as building blocks as well in the body, in terms of building tissues and enzymes and hormones and things like that. Now, in HA, common sort of first line advice is based on research which indicates, and also through clinical practice, that actually carbohydrates and fats tend to be lower in women who are experiencing this issue. Now, it's not always, that's really important. It's not always, which is why I can't give a blanket, everyone should focus on carbohydrates, everyone should focus on fats. And what's really interesting is that protein is actually really important as well. And I sometimes see, really interestingly, the diet is actually quite low in protein. And protein is very important when we think about menstrual cycle regularity, and certainly through period recovery. You know, you need protein in terms of the health and the function of our uterus lining, our endometrial lining, and protein turnover there. It's also really important for blood sugar balance, glycemic regulation, and bone health, because around 50% of your bone is protein. So I don't want people to overlook protein, but essentially we need a balance of all three macronutrients. And I tend to sort of advise, you know, broadly speaking, if I haven't seen anything, any food diary, anything, generally speaking, a third of the plate is carbohydrate sources, so things like whole grains, rice, pasta, baked goods, breads, things like that. A third of the plate is protein-based foods, and no more than a third of the plate is vegetables. But we don't want to, again, vegetables are very much still on the menu. Fiber can be problematic, so excess fiber in the diet, lots and lots of fruit and vegetables, you know, can reduce your capacity to meet your energy requirement. A few other mechanisms as well can potentially disturb hormone balance, but fiber is also really incredibly important in the diet, so we want to keep it there for various reasons. And then we want to add fat to that meal. So whether or not we're cooking in olive oil or butter or rapeseed oil or whatever, we're using fats in some way, maybe we're adding some cheese, some avocado, some other lovely rich sources of fat into that meal. That's kind of like a nice staple in terms of the macronutrients. And I appreciate I've only just talked about the macronutrients there. But does that help as a starting point? And if you want me to talk about the micronutrients, I certainly can.
Yeah, honestly, no, that's amazing. I think you've done so well to get so much information in there, and you've put it in a really like nice, easy to understand way, because I think nutrition can get very complicated for people when they're trying to recover their period. They're told so many different things and they're just like, oh, I don't even know where to start now. I wanted to touch on what you said about the carbs. So I've always been like a carb lover. Like I love bread. I love like high carb snacks and that kind of thing. And throughout pretty much like, even like throughout my eating disorder, probably not most of my diet, but at least half of like my intake was from carbs. And that was the same after eating disorder recovery. When I had HA still, I was still eating like about 50% carbs, yet I didn't have my period. So it's, you know, it's obviously just there's an imbalance somewhere else. So it's, you know, it's not just carbs that we need to eat. So I'm so glad you mentioned about like the protein being so important and the fats. A quick question, and I wasn't sure how to word this, because I don't want it to come across as like, oh, we should be restricting these foods. But are there any foods that people should avoid in recovery? I know you mentioned a bit about the vegetables and not overdoing it, but it was just a question that came into my head.
I think it's a really good question, and it's not one I'm often asked. It's not one I would often give a sort of a really consolidated answer to either. Again, without seeing, a client and understanding if there are any, food sensitivities. They may have food sensitivities, intolerances that in this situation are more likely to be transient. So it's quite complex when we start talking about intolerances and things. Generally speaking, at least 50% of the clients that I work with have had an experience of disordered eating in the past. Now, they may not have when they see me, and but I am very gentle and cautious about advising people not to eat anything. So no, it's not in my practice would I ever say don't eat XYZ. And you know, and also the vegetables are still really important. You know, I know that it's not all about eating ice cream. You know, there is lots of goodness to be had in the diet, and what's incredibly common is low dietary diversity. So this is problematic when, you know, often clients, through maybe they're just really, really busy, you know, we have really busy lives now, maybe they feel safe with a certain, you know, menu each week, and that's quite restricted in terms of the types of nutrients, sorry, the types of foods that they're getting, and then that sort of filters down into their nutrient pool is actually quite you know, it's quite dilute. They're not getting enough of all the different types of nutrients that they need. So it's always about, so I've kind of skirted around your question, but it's usually about adding in. It's usually always about adding in, shaking things up, getting some variety in there. And certainly in terms of making sure we've got good levels of the micronutrients as well, which we haven't really talked about, which are as important, maybe not the big building blocks there, but they are also very important too.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you. I thought I'd just throw that question in, but I'm glad that you've clarified that. Every food is acceptable. We don't just need to sit there eating ice cream. We don't need to sit there eating vegetables. We can have both.
Yes.
So
but probably not together.
Well, maybe not together. I feel like that's something I would probably do, because I do have some weird food combinations, but that's a whole other
Oh,
topic.
that's hilarious. Yeah, another
So,
podcast.
what was that?
That should be another topic for a podcast.
Yeah, weird food combinations. So let's actually get into the micronutrients, because I'm really interested to hear about, you know, if there are specific micronutrients that are particularly good for period recovery, or even for cycle optimization, if someone has started to get their periods back and they're trying to, you know, get that nice 28 to 35 day cycle. So let's delve into the micronutrients.
Yeah, so this as well is a really fascinating topic, and I'm going to try and cover both of your questions there, or touch on the second one in terms of cycle optimization again. So the main issue that we have with micronutrients, or if you like, assessing micronutrient status in hypothalamic amenorrhea, is that there's what I call like a reverse causality issue. Okay, so does low levels of a certain micronutrient cause HA or contribute to HA and can therefore reverse it? Or does HA cause depletions in certain nutrients? So we can't always distinguish. We do the testing for certain micronutrients is incredibly important. Certain micronutrients like vitamin D and iron, we don't want to over supplement. Iron should never be supplemented without doing a blood test anyway. So we need to be careful about, you know, whether or not we're introducing supplements or even sort of recommending high doses of certain foods to people. But if I take vitamin D as a really good example of this. So vitamin D is often deficient in people with hypothalamic amenorrhea, or low or insufficient. And it's important because it is important in the context of reproductive health. So vitamin D, there are receptors for vitamin D in all sorts of tissues, but there are in every single reproductive tissue. So we know it's important. We don't know exactly how, but we know it's important. And low levels of vitamin D are associated with longer cycles, longer follicular phase, and a shorter luteal phase as well. But when we think about, is this vitamin D level low? Like, is this low because someone has low dietary diversity, they're not taking in very many vitamin D rich foods, they have low energy intake, they have low sun exposure? That can be a kind of confounding factor in depression. Actually, it's actually their vitamin D levels are low. Is that causing the depression, or is it just that these people are low, so they're not going out to the sunshine? But what's really interesting with hypothalamic amenorrhea, which is associated with low levels of estrogen, is that estrogen actually is involved in increasing an enzyme that activates vitamin D. So we know from studies in menopausal women that, this low estrogen state can contribute to vitamin D deficiency or low levels of vitamin D. So we've got this problem in terms of it's a chicken or the egg, isn't it? And this happens with quite a lot of nutrients in this situation. I guess I'm telling you that to sort of say that it's not about certain types of nutrients fix the period. I guess it's slightly more complex, but at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter what caused the low vitamin D in the first place, but we do need to correct it. And we do also need to be mindful that if there's disturbances in these hormones that are actually changing how we metabolize micronutrients. So it can actually be quite difficult to correct these problems. So I hope that sort of gives you an understanding about why. Some of the other nutrients that are important and commonly low are iron. So iron is often also seen to be low in hypothalamic amenorrhea. Why is it important? Well, it's important in energy metabolism, in terms of nervous system health. It helps with neurotransmission and the little kind of fatty sheath that runs around our nerve cells. And it does all sorts of other wonderful things in the body. It's obviously an incredibly important part of our blood system as well. And what's interesting again with iron is that it's often low due to low dietary intake, but also poor absorption. And that might be due to heavy exercise, which can raise what we call these sort of inflammatory molecules that cause the increase of another hormone, which reduces the absorption of iron. There are other reasons as well why that might happen, but iron, why it's important in terms of your recovering menstrual cycle health has a lot to do with energy metabolism. So this is the role of iron, the role iron plays in thyroid health, and that kind of cellular level. It can exacerbate this sort of low metabolic state when we don't have enough levels of iron. So correcting iron again could be, it could certainly be one of the things that could accelerate recovery or improve recovery, but again, must not be supplemented without testing. And actually excess iron can actually lower levels of leptin, which is a hormone which may be involved in the whole development of this problem, this hypothalamic amenorrhea. So again, it's all about tailoring this to somebody. What do they need? We look at their iron stores, we look at their whole status, we look at their diet, we see, what's their intake like. If there's something not matching up, like they've got a lot of good sort of iron sources in there and low levels, we think about absorption issues. So how can we optimize that? And then I'll just touch on some of the other ones. So magnesium and zinc are also potentially quite important. They are commonly depleted by exercise and stress. Magnesium itself is incredibly important in terms of stress, and deficiency can increase your susceptibility to it. Zinc as well. So we kind of want to check and see if we've got any evidence that they might be low in the diet. Folate is another one that's incredibly interesting one in terms of hypothalamic amenorrhea, because there is evidence that those people with hypothalamic amenorrhea have changes in their metabolism of folate, and folate is incredibly important for fertility. When this change occurs, the eggs in the ovary are actually less sensitive to follicle stimulating hormone. So this is a big kind of area of interest of mine in terms of research. Is folate actually a key here? Interestingly though, most of the diets that I see aren't low in folate. So again, it comes down to this sort of, how is the body processing this nutrient, and is it actually processing it into the active form? And if not, why not? So there could be a hormone-ish sort of mechanism behind that, but I think we've got a long way to go in terms of trying to figure that out. So those are some of the key ones. There are others as well. And I think in terms of cycle optimization, this does again come down to, okay, if someone wants to optimize the cycle. Why? Like, what's the issue? Is there, you know, are they experiencing irregular cycles or PMS, for example? So it really comes down to sort of what they're trying to optimize. But zinc, I would probably give a little shout out to zinc on PMS. There's been a really cool recent trial that was done that showed, you know, that zinc was, you know, could help with PMS symptoms. So, you know, zinc, again, we're thinking about seafood. I haven't really gone into the sources of these, I'm so sorry. But sort of seafood, nuts and seeds, especially pumpkin seeds. Oysters are a fabulous source of zinc. So if you ever have the opportunity to have oysters, I always say have an oyster if you're on holiday or something. But that gives you kind of an idea of, you know, there's an element of complexity to it, but it's usually, you know, we need to understand more about the individual and do a bit of detective work with them as well.
100%. Yeah. Oh, thank you for sharing. You've got so much knowledge. I could listen to you talk about this all day because it's fascinating to me. But we should definitely do another episode solely on sort of micronutrients, because
it's complex.
there is so much. Yeah, like there is so much that could be said about them. And, you know, from what you've said there, it sounds like it is so nuanced and so individualistic. And it's not just about, oh, I'm not eating enough iron, so I just increase my iron intake through my diet, because then you have to think about, is it being absorbed properly? Is it being used properly? Like it's not just about increasing your dietary intake. And I think that just makes it so much more complicated. But that's why I guess working with a professional is important, so that they can, you know, figure out what needs doing. So if somebody wanted to, say, work with someone like you, would they have to get, like, would you recommend that they get like a blood test first to check for certain levels of different hormones and vitamins and things?
They certainly can do. What I tend to find is people do come to me with blood tests, but there's just a few things missing that I want to know. And also that, you know, I try to always have a blood test done within the last 3 months. So if someone's just outside that 3-month mark, then I will retest all the hormones again anyway. I do all the testing. So I do through a partner company, which, you know, has a medical team review all the results too, which is fantastic. But, you know, in terms of the interest of this podcast, if there's anyone out there doing this on their own, and, you know, or just wanting to get their own tests done, some of the things we look for are, obviously we test the hormones. So we test the LH, the FSH, the estradiol, the testosterone, the free androgen index. They're normally, I'm just going through these in my head, they're normally all normal to low. With the LH and FSH ratio is generally normal, so lower LH to FSH ratio. If it's flipped the other way, then, you know, and there are other symptoms and other sort of markers we might suspect polycystic ovarian syndrome. We also test sex hormone binding globulin. That's also important. That's normally normal or higher in hypothalamic amenorrhea. It's likely to be on the lower end of the spectrum in polycystic ovarian syndrome. The estradiol and the free testosterone, again, are likely to be normal or low. And you can see this pattern developing here with, you can get most polycystic ovarian syndrome and HA can both present with normal test results, but they may be just slightly, you know, this is why looking at the pattern, they may be slightly, if the sex hormone binding globulin is a little bit on the low end of the spectrum and testosterone is high, you know, and then you've got that LH FSH flipped ratio, we might think, you know, this is more of that, this less of a kind of suppression of the reproductive system that we see in hypothalamic amenorrhea, and more of a desynchronization of it, which is more sort of polycystic ovarian syndrome. But anyway, back to HA. What else do we test? Thyroid hormones. So again, thyroid hormones may are likely to be normal to low with HA anyway, because we're in this kind of hypometabolic state, this kind of slowed down metabolic state. So they commonly co-occur, but what we're checking for there is if there's any additional kind of an organic thyroid issue. So which is why we also often look at autoimmune markers as well, just to make sure that the period isn't missing, because actually there's actually a thyroid issue, not a reproductive issue. So we just sort of check that. Again, I'm not in a position to diagnose. A doctor, that's what a doctor does, but we tend to just check these things anyway. Nutrient levels, we look at key nutrient levels such as vitamin D, iron status, folate, B12, and then various other things. We look at the blood, the health of the blood, the full blood count, the immune status, which is often a little bit suppressed potentially, and various other things as well. So it's pretty extensive what I do, but that's because I don't want to leave a stone unturned. And often people are coming to me where they've tried stuff and they've been trying on their own for a while, and we actually need to cast a bit of a net out and just have a look at everything and just make sure we've not missed something here. Yeah, I think I've gone through all, racking my brains if I missed something significant here, but I think that's basically what we test for. Yeah.
No, honestly, so many different tests and so many different little things that could be part of the issue. And like you said, sometimes you might not necessarily, like, your periods might be all over the place because of like a thyroid issue or something else. And you really have to do that deep dive to figure out what's going on so that you can then help the person and say, right, this is the sort of nutrition you need to focus on, exercise wise you need to focus on this. And it's just all so complex, isn't it, really?
Well, yeah, I mean, it is, but at the end of the day, it's one blood test, so it sounds really complex in terms of, but I try to, I don't want clients to worry about that. That's what I'm there for, so they just do the blood test, and then, if there's something that comes out of that, that's where we gives us more information, and we know how to, what to focus on, as you say, what's the priority, in terms of getting them back to balance, back to normal.
Yeah, 100%. And I keep going back to it, but that is why working with a professional can be so helpful. I think especially with something so complex as hypothalamic amenorrhea, and if you're doing it on your own, you just don't really even know where to start. And then you feel like you're trying things, but it's not working. And you're like, why is it not working? And it might be because
Yeah.
of one nutrient, or it might be a combination of things. And it's about doing that detective work.
Yeah, and it is likely to be a combination of things. Very unlikely to be one nutrient. It's usually, it's a lifestyle thing. It's a stress thing. It's potentially there's another medical condition underlying this. It's, and going back to some of the fundamentals and the basics. So we've obviously gone quite down into some of the detail on some of the nutrients, but we do have to come back to the energy status, and the energy balance, and making sure that you're not in a negative energy balance, either overall or in certain parts of the day. And those are certainly things that people don't necessarily need to see a professional for. You can make some of those changes yourself and just see how far you get with it, and you may find that that's all you need. Actually, it's just making some tweaks to your energy balance. And then if you do find that you have issues with your cycle ongoing, that's where there may be something out of kilter that does need addressing. And I do work with clients who've got their period back already, and something's not quite right. So we're just sort of looking to give them that, as you use that word, optimize. In some ways I don't like that word, optimize, but you kind of optimizing the cycle in that way. That's the word they often use when they come to see me. So that's all helpful as well.
Yeah, it's a bit like a buzzword, isn't it? Optimize.
Yeah, I find
But
it a bit odd. The body, I don't feel like we optimize the body. I feel like the body does its thing, and we just want to support it to do its thing, because it's actually already pretty amazing.
yeah, honestly, the body is amazing. It fascinates me. It blows my mind. But yeah, I mean, obviously we focus mainly on nutrition in this episode, but obviously we can't forget about the other factors like exercise and stress. But they are things that we could do whole series of episodes on because they're so complex as well. But thank you so much for sharing all of your knowledge today. And I would absolutely love to bring you back on to talk about, maybe to talk about stress, or,
Yeah, of course.
there's so many things that we could talk about.
Of course, I'd love to, and thank you so much. And it's a pleasure. It really, really is, and it's so great that you're doing this podcast. It's just so important to get more information out there to people who are just, very, on their own, and it's really isolating. And so it's just so wonderful. So thank you very much for having me. It's been great.
Oh, thanks a lot for that. It really means a lot. And yeah, it's been so amazing. And yeah, I'll link all of your information in the show notes. So if people want to check out, like, your Instagram is, I love it. Like, I reshare so many of your posts because I always see them and I'm like, people need to know about this. More people need to see it. So I'm going to link your Instagram. And if you've got like a website, I'll put that in the show notes so people can get in touch with you if they really do want that extra support and that guidance.
Thank you. Yeah, for sure. They're very, very welcome to reach out and just and have a chat and see where they are. That's fine.